Everybody think in France, in the European Union, that Greenland is not to be sold, not to be taken.
And I think we're going to get it. One way or the other, we're going to get it.
Why should he do that? We don't want to be bought. We don't really want to be bought.
$3.1 billion in mining and energy investments poured into Greenland, and not a single U.S. company was invited. While Washington was still talking about annexation, Canada and Europe quietly built a real-world alliance, one that now controls key rare earths energy corridors and long-term Arctic infrastructure. The fallout was immediate. Lockheed Martin announced delays to its hypersonic missile tests, blaming uncertainty in raw material supplies. Raytheon shifted its search for molybdenum, a critical component in heat-resistant alloys, to Chile and Australia, after Greenland's reserves were locked into Europe-bound contracts. Meanwhile, Germany began phasing out reliance on U.S. LNG, pivoting toward a new Arctic gas route led by Canadian firms. So, while Trump stood at the podium and declared, "We will get it one way or another," Canada and the EU already had.
Well, we need Greenland for national security purposes. I've been told that for a long time.
And this time, the Arctic wasn't won with power plays, but with partnerships. The United States talked about annexation. But when it came to action, all it could muster was a symbolic gesture. In March 2025, a C-130 military transport plane landed at Thule Air Base in northern Greenland, a textbook show the flag maneuver. There were no new bases, no signed agreements, no mineral rights, just optics. Meanwhile, Canada sealed the real deal. Two Canadian companies, Greenland Resources and Amarok Minerals, finalized a $3 billion contract with the government of Greenland, backed by the European Investment Bank, Norway's sovereign wealth fund, and UK-based private equity. The U.S. was completely excluded from the table, and the consequences rippled fast through the American defense sector. Lockheed Martin officially delayed its hypersonic weapons testing program until 2030, citing disrupted access to molybdenum. Raytheon scrambled to find new suppliers in Chile and Australia after Greenland's resources were rerouted to Europe. The Inflation Reduction Act, which linked EV tax credits to U.S.-sourced components, failed to account for this shift, triggering major supply chain risks in domestic battery production. Even within NATO, the backlash was visible. France deployed a nuclear-powered submarine to Baffin Bay, officially for observation, but the message was unmistakable. At the same time, Canada issued a diplomatic warning any U.S. pressure on Greenland's autonomy would violate the spirit and possibly the legal foundation of the alliance itself. So, while Washington repeated slogans about control, Canada and Europe quietly built leverage. And by the time the U.S. realized it had been sidelined, the Arctic board had already been rearranged without American pieces. While Washington was left posturing, Canada and Europe were building. In early 2025, they launched the Arctic Green Transition Fund, a $3.1 billion investment mechanism backed by Canada's Ministry of Finance, the European Investment Bank, and Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund. The U.S. wasn't just excluded, it was irrelevant. No American institution was invited to participate. But this wasn't just about funding. The deal came with non-negotiable conditions. At least 70% of the workforce on all Greenlandic mining projects had to be local, and 10% of all profits would go directly into Greenland's future fund in Nuuk, a sovereign development fund modeled after New Zealand's Maui framework. These weren't symbolic clauses, they were structural commitments to Greenlandic autonomy. And for Ottawa and Brussels, they were a fair price to pay. For Washington, they were a deal-breaker. Then came the next move. In July 2025, Greenland's parliament passed the Infrastructure Phalag Act, codifying these requirements into law. The message was unmistakable. Foreign companies could no longer treat Greenland as a resource colony. They had to share revenue, employ locals, and invest in long-term political stability or walk away. Europe, of course, didn't walk away. The EU's Critical Raw Materials Act, passed in 2023, requires at least 25% of all rare earths used in Europe to come from allied ethical sources. Greenland, sitting on vast molybdenum, gold, and zirconium deposits and politically aligned with Denmark, fit perfectly into that strategy. For Brussels, it was a geopolitical jackpot. And so Greenland, once viewed as a frozen frontier, was reborn as a development lab for Arctic sustainability, where green mining, fair labor, and geopolitical autonomy are no longer idealistic slogans, but the new operating standard. Canada and the EU didn't just adapt to the new Arctic, they rewrote the rules before Washington knew the game had changed.
We will always be a part of NATO. We will always be a strong partner for US. We are close neighbors. We have been cooperated in the last 80 years. And I think the future have a lot to offer to cooperate with, but we want to also be clear. We don't want to be Americans. We don't want to be a part of U.S., but we want a strong cooperation together with U.S.
At the center of the Arctic standoff wasn't just strategy, it was symbolism. In March 2025, during a nationally televised speech to Congress, President Donald Trump declared he will get it one way or another. The line made headlines, but it wasn't just rhetoric. It was the formal reawakening of one of Trump's most controversial ambitions, bringing Greenland under U.S. control. Unlike his 2019 proposal, which was widely mocked and ultimately dismissed, this time Trump came prepared. Backed by the National Security Council and newly appointed defense officials, he made Greenland a central pillar of his second-term foreign policy platform. Behind the scenes, Trump's team revived two dormant Cold War-era documents, the Arctic Gap Identification Protocol, a 1950s plan designed to fill radar blind spots along the polar route, and the Thule Radar Belt Draft, a Reagan-era defense strategy aimed at tracking Soviet missile activity. Both documents were military in nature, but this time the focus was expanded. Trump's advisors emphasized that Greenland wasn't just a radar gap, it was a resource jackpot. Geological surveys had estimated over 38 billion tons of rare earth metals, massive deposits of molybdenum and zirconium, and 17 billion barrels of recoverable Arctic oil. Add to that Greenland's strategic location sitting between Russia's submarine routes and U.S. radar coverage in Alaska, and Trump's calculus was clear: whoever controls Greenland controls the future of Arctic power. But as Washington escalated, so did the resistance, and not just from foreign capitals. Inside the U.S., Trump's push triggered internal fractures. Senator Lisa Murkowski, representing Alaska, openly criticized the administration's hardline stance. She warned that military escalation in the Arctic could irreparably harm fragile ecosystems and strain diplomatic ties with Canada and Nordic allies. In a rare bipartisan moment, Democratic senators from Maine and Vermont proposed an alternative path, a multilateral Arctic mining partnership built on cooperation, environmental standards, and shared profit. They argued that America's strength wasn't in coercion, but in coalition building. Internationally, the backlash came even faster and louder. Within days of Trump's one way or another speech, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen reaffirmed that Greenland belongs to the Greenlanders. But the real blow came from Nuuk. On March 12, 2025, the Greenlandic government and the Danish monarchy issued a joint declaration stating unequivocally that Greenland's sovereignty was not open for negotiation, and they went further. The statement warned that any coercive pressure by a NATO member on another member's territory would undermine the very foundation of the alliance. In diplomatic terms, it was a direct shot at the United States and a warning to other NATO capitals. That warning didn't fall on deaf ears. France deployed a nuclear submarine to Baffin Bay, framing it as a maritime observation mission, but few missed the political message. Norway backed Denmark. Poland stayed silent, worried about jeopardizing its strategic ties with Washington. Even Canada issued a veiled warning stating that resource extraction between allies must never be confused with coercion. Instead of isolating America's rivals, Trump's Greenland strategy began to push allies into each other's arms. Canada, Denmark, and the EU saw the writing on the wall and moved quickly to solidify their own Arctic presence, not through force, but through finance and diplomacy. And while Trump attempted to wrap the Greenland mission in the language of national security, the world saw something different: a great power trying to impose its will on a self-governing territory under NATO protection. In the end, Trump's obsession with Greenland revealed a deeper flaw in his Arctic playbook. He mistook hard power for leverage. But in a region defined by climate community and multilateral treaties, that kind of leverage doesn't hold. What began as a bold attempt to plant an American flag on the Arctic map ended with a fractured alliance, a unified European response, and the acceleration of Canada and the EU's dominance in the region. Rather than achieving control, Trump united the opposition and changed the Arctic power balance in ways Washington didn't foresee. While Washington focused on confrontation, Canada quietly built a new architecture of Arctic influence. What began as a strategic reaction to Trump's Greenland obsession has now evolved into something far more durable: a multilateral cross-sectoral network known as the Arctic Hexagon. Stretching from Baffin Island to Devon Island and across to Greenland, this emerging corridor integrates critical mineral extraction, aerospace infrastructure, and radar coverage into a single Canadian-led framework. For the first time in decades, Ottawa, not Washington, is shaping the contours of Arctic development. At the center of this transformation is energy. As Trump politicized U.S. LNG exports and tied permits to foreign policy leverage, European buyers began looking elsewhere. Canadian firm Cedar Energy responded by launching negotiations to build a floating LNG terminal off the coast of Ditches Bay, Greenland. The proposed terminal would bypass U.S. WAs, ports entirely sending Arctic gas directly to European markets. For energy-hungry nations like Germany, it was a lifeline. Once heavily reliant on U.S. LNG after cutting ties with Russia, Germany is now diversifying, and Arctic LNG from the Canada-Greenland axis is at the top of the list. As one German official put it, the more predictable the supplier, the safer the supply. Canada and Greenland, with their stable legal frameworks and multilateral investment strategies, are exactly that. For the U.S., the shift is more than economic, it's geopolitical. The Trump administration may talk about military options, but Greenland is still part of the Kingdom of Denmark, a full NATO member. That means any unilateral military move, no matter how symbolic, risks triggering Article 5, the very foundation of NATO's collective defense. In simple terms, any coercive action against Greenland could be interpreted as an attack on an ally. Even short of military escalation, the mere perception of pressure has already damaged U.S. standing within the alliance. While France sends submarines and Canada leads infrastructure projects, the U.S. is increasingly seen as a destabilizing actor, not a dependable Arctic partner. Zooming out, this isn't just about Greenland anymore. It's about the future shape of Arctic governance. As pipelines, radar stations, shipping reroutes, and energy hubs take form under Canadian and European leadership, the strategic color of the Arctic is shifting from a frozen frontier dominated by American assumptions to a multilateral chessboard where middle powers hold more influence than ever before. And in that new game, the rules no longer revolve around who speaks the loudest, but around who builds the most. Trump didn't gain Greenland, he lost control of the Arctic. Canada and the EU didn't need to fire a shot. They came with capital environmental safeguards and indigenous partnerships tools Washington couldn't or wouldn't offer. Today, Greenland is no longer an island for sale. It's a strategic hinge where middle powers like Canada are winning not through dominance, but through diplomacy. What do you think? Will the U.S. adapt or keep chasing Cold War dreams? Drop your thoughts below. Subscribe for more Arctic deep dives. Like if you believe smart alliances beat brute force.